大家好，那我们待会就差不多，因为稍微 delay 一下，那我们待会就会请原厂的人员来跟我们做一下今天的一个介绍，这样子。那今天来的是那个 Wilko 他本人，那他是原厂的那个技术人员兼专案经理，所以他会帮我们做一下相关的一些研究的一些介绍。对，那后续等于是前面先会由他这边跟大家做产品介绍，那包含一些功能的一些，比如说最新研究的一些趋势，那去做一些分享。那在后半段之后，就是中间我们会休息，那之后后半段看大家有没有什么问题可以跟他做询问。对，那询问完之后呢，那最后因为他有一些事情可能会先离开，那后面会再由我们这边跟大家做实际上的今天的那个 FaceRead 的这个软体的实际上操作这样子。那操作过程当中，就是如果说有什么问题的话，想要比如说要亲自体验看看啊，还是说你们未来相关研究会有一些实际操作面上面一些需求的话，也可以到跟我们做询问讨论。那剩下一些比如说一些比较研究趋势或应用面的部分的话，那当然因为他就原厂本人在嘛，所以如果说有这方面相关的一些疑问需求的话，都可以直接跟他本人做询问，这样 OK。好，那今天我们就欢迎 Wilko。
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah? Thank you for coming to see us today. I was asked to speak a little bit more about facial expressions in general, and specifically more about the use or the validity of facial expression research in relation to language and interpersonal communication. Now, facial expressions to me are super interesting for a number of reasons, and I will try to address all those reasons in my presentation. But I would also like to ask you almost, or to challenge you to try and think what facial expressions mean to you and how you use them, consciously or subconsciously. Because for me that's the interesting part, because the main message that I always try to deliver to everyone and everywhere that I speak is that facial expressions are not set. It's not a given criteria. Expressions are fluid. They are subject to development. They are subject to locality, to culture. So it's a very fluid and developed medium that continues to evolve. And I guess the same thing goes for language. The same thing goes for interpersonal communication. Contemporary communication, for a large part, is online communication, or is on-screen communication, or we communicate through imagery in marketing and in adverts. And expression analysis and emotional engagement, especially in customer research or in consumer science, for a very large part, try to tap into these facial expressions or perceived emotions, if you will. Because in my personal belief, the interest in facial expressions for a large part stems from the desire to understand and to a certain extent control people's emotions. Does that make sense? So what I'm trying to do already at this point in my talk is create a division between facial expressions and emotions. Because for me, they are two different things. They are connected consciously, but also by the unconscious. But this is something that we need to be very, very aware of. They are not hardwired. An expression on a face does not one-on-one correlate to an emotion. Yeah. Other than, on the contrary to what maybe popular belief is trying to teach us. Yeah. Traditional view of emotions and facial expressions is almost a cartoonesque-like representation of emotions, basic emotions. If you look at the representation of Ekman's 7 basic emotions in scientific literature, you almost get like a cartoonesque kind of feeling from it. Yeah, if you look at these expressions representing basic emotions, as people say, they're not so different from what Pixar did. But this is a very classical way of viewing emotions, very one-dimensional way of viewing emotions. And the interesting part about this representation of emotion and correlated facial expressions is that when we then start digging into this a little bit further, I don't know if any of you have seen this particular Pixar animation film. It's interesting because it's about a young girl and her experiences to a large extent are being controlled by these 5 inner emotions. And the emotions are represented as these individual characters in the film. But if you then look further into what these characters represent in the film, it already becomes a lot more complex. Because joy, representing happiness, has character traits that are much more complex than merely happy. Yeah? Because here they mention joyfulness, interest, playfulness, confidence, love, sensitivity, courage, and hope. But if I would address a subject and tell that subject, now give me a courageous facial expression, show courage on your face, would they give me a smile? Or would they show me something else? I am willing to bet quite a bit of money that no test subject who I ask to give me a courageous facial expression will show me a full-on smile. Nobody will. Probably their facial expressions will go more towards angry, to show determination. So there's a huge level of complexity in these facial expressions, emotion connection, that shows a lot more nuance than merely a smile on the face. So yes, all these things, in my opinion, are part of a mental state that we could describe as happiness. Yeah? If you have a courageous, joyful, sensitive, loving person, to me that sounds like somebody that is probably very happy. Yeah. But all these different aspects cannot be translated one-to-one into a facial expression or a singular emotion. Does that make sense? So the same thing, to a certain extent, can be said for language. Language is as fluid, as subject to development, and as complex as what I just described. Yeah, if we look into language science and we tap into things like innuendo, or all of a sudden we try to understand sarcasm, or cynicism, or stoicism, it's a subtle use of language and words, a way of building sentences by which you insinuate things. Language cannot be translated one-on-one, at least not spoken language. Okay. This is also why reading is so fascinating, because you have written language, and the whole interpretation of that written language is up to you. So it leaves the mind free to wander. You can create any kind of world that you like around the words that are written on paper. So that's why everybody perceives a book in a slightly different way. And this is the beauty of the human mind. But these classical views of emotions, as they have been described extensively in literature over the past decades, are very much under development. This is a theory that is still very much evolving. But when facial expression analysis became part of the scientific tool set, let's put it that way, it was first captured in very complex interpretive protocols. Fax coding. This was something that required training, extensive training, and people had to be quite skillful to be able to effectively code facial expressions on test subjects. Now with computer technology evolving and progressing, there's a lot of automated facial expression software tools in the market. Noldus, my company, is one of the biggest companies providing that sort of software facial expression tool called FaceReader. So all of a sudden, we don't need a skilled, trained observer anymore to analyze expressions, but we have an objective software tool that can quantify data points on the face and analyze facial expressions. So this is the first attempt to get a more objective measurement for facial expressions. Oh. Why do you not play? Yeah, so what we do is we find 500 different data points on the face of our test subject and record the position of those data points. And then by measuring the distance between data points and the way they change over time, we can then make an interpretation of which muscle groups have been engaged and how those muscle groups translate into facial expressions. Yeah. Is everybody acquainted with basic fax coding? Does everybody know what that means? Yeah. We look at engagement of specific muscle groups in the face. Yeah, so a smile consists of lip curlers, eye raisers, eyebrow raisers, all these muscles start moving in the face when a smile occurs. And by looking at which muscle groups are involved in a specific expression, we can make an interpretation of what kind of expression that is. Whether it's anger, disgust, happiness, sadness, as you like. By looking into more detail, you can, for example, looking at specific muscle groups representing a smile, you can even distinguish a Duchenne smile from a genuine smile. Yeah? Where in some situations people only smile with the mouth, which is perceived as a fake smile. Yeah? Because a true smile also has involvement of the eyes. But again, yeah, the video shows this person going through a number of basic emotions, emotional expressions, and you can see a very clear readout by the software of those basic expressions. But the interesting part for me starts at the end of this clip, where he starts doing all kinds of silly things. And you will see that the software will still try to perceive those silly facial expressions in terms of emotion. And to me, that proves the disconnect between facial expressions and true emotions. Emotions are more complex than what we see on the face. In fact, emotions and facial expressions in reality are much more subject to personal experiences and associations in the brain. In short, personal experiences are interpreted by the brain to give a meaning to reality. So there's things happening around us, and our brain is constantly trying to make sense of all these things, to give meaning to a situation. And these meanings can be perceived as a concept of emotion. Yeah, experience can have a positive meaning, a negative meaning, and there's a lot of nuance in that. And the emotions find expression on the face as a means of communication to the outside world. And this part can be conscious or unconscious. Sometimes experiences are so intense that the emotional expressions on the face override consciousness. Yeah? True fear, sometimes people get so afraid they forget about what happens on their face. Yeah? Because the experience is too intense. Happiness, sometimes you're so happy you're just beside yourself. Again, you kind of lose the consciousness towards your facial expressions. You show true happiness, true joy. But in most communication, facial expressions are a tool. When I give a talk like this, I cannot just look at the clock in the back of the room for half an hour and speak to the clock. Yeah, because maybe 5 minutes and everybody will stop paying attention to what I say. So I have to learn as a speaker to try and address all the people in the room. My facial expressions and the way I address each and every person in the room is a big part of that. Yeah. Personally, as a speaker, I use my hands a lot. This is not something I learned. I found it's purely genetic. My father was a teacher, and when I look at old pictures of him, he looks exactly like me. Or maybe I look exactly like my father. I don't know. But we do this a lot. We use our hands with everything we do. Gestures, again, large part of communications. Body posture, big part in communication. And all these things together pose a highly complex system of emotional state. And facial expression analysis is the first step to try to understand part of this process and to translate it and to measure it. Okay? Because ultimately, we have to admit that words and actions are not always the same. We do not always say what we feel. Or, in a lot of situations, we do not always perceive every aspect of our actions. We don't remember it. Or our mind is constantly selecting what is important and what is not. So if we have test subjects, and for example, this example comes from comparing self-report in test subjects to observed routines by an independent observer. And this is a report about beauty routines. Test subjects doing their hair and makeup in the morning, getting dressed, applying creams, makeup, nail polish, etc., etc., doing their hair, using products for the hair. When those subjects were asked, so can you explain your beauty routine to us? They only accounted for 25 to 45% of the actual routine. So the test subject only summarizes the whole routine, only addressing what they feel are the most important parts. But the actual routine is much more extensive, right? So, for example, there was a study done on shaving behavior in men. Shaving using razors. And they were asked to evaluate the quality of the razor. And there were some people that were shaving in a very strange way. And then when they asked, in a very awkward way, and they said, when they asked, how do you like the razor? And they said, oh yes, it's very nice. We really like it. And then when you look at the information, you see how much they struggle with the actual device, and you ask them, why do you struggle so much? They said, well, if I use it differently, I cut myself. Which is completely contradictory information. Because if you ask the subject, are you satisfied with the product? They say yes. But on the other hand, if you look past that and look at the details, they actually use the product in an unintended way because otherwise they cut themselves, suggesting that the product is not as good as you thought it was after all. Because if people have to use it in a funny way to prevent cuts, maybe there's room for improvement. Yeah, so self-report does not always represent truth. And what we say in language does not always translate directly into perceived experience or truth, if you will. So, rather than traditional methodology in social sciences, what we've tried to introduce over the past decades is unobtrusive observation methods. Meaning methods by which we can observe human behavior without the subject being aware. Right? Traditional anthropology, in a way, was already aware of the disconnect between actual reality and reported reality. Because traditional anthropology has always been a very strong advocate for participant observation, which was saying, if you want to understand how a culture works, you have to go there and live like one of them. That is the only way to experience it. But that would give a highly personal account of a reality. So again, it's perceived reality rather than fact. So there is a strong need for unobtrusive observation methods. And this is a technique that was initially adopted from animal research, because it allows people to go about their way, and there's no interference in any way from the researcher. So behaviors can be classified, and they can be predefined, so we can actually capture terms of behavior in an objective way. And if we have that, we can also start quantifying specific behaviors, specific expressions. Yeah. This is also where the facial expression software comes from. A need to quantify. Because if I measure a test subject with facial expression software, I can, after my test, I can make a report saying, this subject was 25% happy. Great. What does that mean? Have you ever been 25% happy? Maybe I have. Have you ever been 25% happy and 15% sad? How do you feel if you're 25% happy, 15% sad? And where did the other 60% go? I don't know. Yeah. But at least we have a way of measuring, and we can start quantifying. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that for a lot of these research methods, data collection methods, we cannot only look at one aspect. We cannot only look at actions, because that way we miss out on motivation. We cannot only look at motivation, and we cannot only look at spoken word. We have to try to build a holistic picture. So we have to pay attention to context. And the only way we can do that is by trying to approach research in a multifaceted way. And the first step to do that in language and communication research was by coding very detailed behaviors on a timeline and integrate those coded behaviors with, for example, video recordings. Yeah, so I can take the fax coding, I can code more complex behaviors in addition to that, and then I have my video and I can analyze them as a whole, and that will give me a more holistic view of the actual behavior of a test subject. So that way we can look how scientists work with this kind of thing. And this is an example of a study in which researchers tried to prove that positive rewards or positive feedback can support positive behavior. Basically, good behavior can be learned in raising children. And good behavior can be learned in a more effective way when we make use of positive rewards. Positive feedback on good behavior. So basically the overall message here is, do not only punish bad behavior, but also reward good behavior. Yeah. And how does facial expression then come into play? Because again, facial expression is a odd measure to include in research. There's many different applications for it. In this case, for example, facial expression analysis was used to look at patients with high body mass index, people that were overweight. And the researchers wanted to know whether overweight people had a different perception of taste. So maybe when people are overweight, they have more craving towards sweet foods or high calorie foods than people that are not overweight. And by evaluating facial expressions, they could actually show that. They could show, when looking at facial expressions, that people with high body mass index reacted more intensively to extreme bitter tastes than people with low body mass index. So the perception of taste in people with high body mass index is different than in people with low body mass index. And this can be shown through facial expressions. Why? If you put something sour in your mouth, you can see it in the face. So there's a facial expression response to taste. This is an entirely different application for facial expression analysis. There's no language involved here. But still we can find a measurement, a data point in facial expressions, in reactions on the face, conscious or subconscious. Another example of facial expression analysis is how people perceive imagery. Nowadays we have all kinds of data collection techniques available, and we can combine all those data streams. Everybody familiar with eye tracking? Yes? Do you know what an eye tracker is? Yeah. So basically we can follow people's eye movements, and when we do that in a computer-based way, we can actually see what they are focusing on the computer screen. So a lot of research that makes use of eye trackers is people that build websites or work with online functionalities. They want to know if I put information on the internet, do people see it? When a customer visits my website, does he see the information? Does he read it? Does he perceive it? And obviously, there's a lot of online marketing. People want to optimize websites because they want to optimize experience of a website. So they want their website to evoke a positive emotion. Now, how do you measure that? There's a lot of effort that goes into analyzing websites. And if you, for example, look at the eye tracking data alone, and you create a heat map of that, you can see that a lot of the attention of test subjects goes here. Yeah? So if I would look at eye tracking information alone, I would say, this is the important part of my website. I have to focus on this. Right? Now, if we take the eye tracking data and correlate it with facial expression analysis and cross-reference it, we get this image, where blue represents positive expressions on the face and red represents negative expressions. So positive valence versus negative valence. And all of a sudden, the picture is entirely different. Yeah? All the positive valence is here, where the picture of the food is. Whereas a lot of the negative valence is here, where the written words are. And this is actually where first I thought was the most important part of my website. But actually, people have spent a lot of effort here trying to read that. And maybe it was too small on the screen, so they start frowning. And you get negative facial expression responses. So this story, where you combine facial expression analysis with eye tracking analysis, tells a different story than the eye tracking alone. So again, this indicates we have to look at the wider picture. We have to try to analyze things from multiple angles. So how can we make use of these facial expressions? And how can we make use of these facial expression analysis tools? And especially we want to look at communication, intercommunication, language. The first example that I want to show you is research on doctor-patient interactions. In hospitals, doctors speak to patients every day. And sometimes these conversations can be quite complex, quite difficult. Sometimes doctors have to bring bad news. Or sometimes they have to explain highly complicated processes to a layperson. But we know that positive interactions in healthcare constitute strongly towards good recovery. So having a positive relationship in a doctor-patient interaction is very important and is very good towards recovery. Yeah, so the use of humor in doctor-patient interactions, however abstract it may seem, may have a positive effect on the doctor-patient relationship, and as such, a positive effect on recovery of a patient, mental state of the patient. Because positive interactions reduce anxiety, people start feeling less afraid. from positive interactions? They put things into perspective. You can have a little joke on the side and put things in perspective sometimes. Yeah. And it affects connectedness. It creates a connection between the doctor and the patient. The distance is smaller. If you can laugh at the same jokes, all of a sudden you're a little bit closer. So it helps build relationships. It helps formulate trust. And it supports, as such, effective information exchange. Right? So this is proven from the research that these people did. Now, how do we make doctors and understand the value of this? By training. And facial expression research can be a big tool in that, in showing physicians, in helping people to understand the value of this positive communication. And there is a direct correlation between facial expressions and communication. If you want a connection, it's there. It is proven that when we present information with a positive expression on our faces, people remember it more. And they understand more. They have a higher level of attention when you speak to them in a positive way. They stay concentrated for a longer period of time. So there is more effective communication of information when we make use of positive facial expressions. Facial expressions. Conscious use of facial expressions. We can do this consciously. If you have a difficult conversation with somebody and you consciously tell yourself, try to be positive, try to put a smile on your face, you will see the changes in the communication. They are instant. When you start smiling at people, they will start smiling back. If you give them an open facial expression, they will respond to it. Because facial expressions are a means of communications. You can ask questions with a facial expression. You can constitute answers. So the way people employ facial expressions supports what they say or contradicts what they say. I was really looking forward to this presentation this morning. I couldn't wait to get here to tell you this story. Yeah, I was really looking forward to this morning. You communicate two different things, right? So people can make use of their facial expressions in language. And they can be trained to do so. And as such, they can improve their communication. And that is what the research was about, ultimately. That is also what this research was about. This was research done by a group that was working with language disorders in youths. So young people suffering language disorders have a hard time in society because they have a hard time understanding complex conversations. They have a hard time formulating sentences. They have difficulties expressing themselves. So finding a job in a situation like that can be very, very difficult and challenging. So the researchers here tried to prepare these young adults with language disorders for job interviews. And they did this by including communication skills into their therapy sessions, by teaching their clients to give positive feedback, to confirm statements, to ask for clarification. So in a way, what the people did here is they taught the subjects, try, if you don't understand, ask for more information. Be open. Be honest. And this can be reinforced by using facial expressions. Because if we only look at verbal communication, everything you say determines what you mean. So verbal communications tells what you say, and it determines how you say it. I can choose different words to describe the same thing. Yeah. I am free to choose which words I use. Non-verbal communication does exactly the same thing. Yeah. With non-verbal communication, I also determine what I say and how I say it, like I just did. I can use the same string of words, but if I change my body and my facial expressions, the message that I communicate changes entirely. Right? So maybe in the case of people that experience difficulty in language or in social communication, think of autism patients. Or in this case, patients with language disorders. We have to consciously train them to employ these assets. Right? Does that make sense? Children that suffer from autism have difficulty interpreting body language in a lot of situations. Yeah. And they don't realize how their own nonverbal communication influences a situation. But this can be learned. Researchers in the UK employed face reader to teach autistic children how to smile. Because all of a sudden, with face reader giving direct feedback, the children had a way of practicing. They could sit at the computer screen and try to make a smile. And the more strong the readout on the face reader software was, the more effective their smile was. And this is a very strong training tool for children with autism, where they can practice things. Because training is key in a lot of situations. So as researchers trying to incorporate facial expressions, emotions into our research, we have to be aware of this. Yeah. For years and years, decades, people were transcribing conversations in psychology to understand minutely what was being communicated in a conversation. A lot of research has been done that way, transcribing conversations word by word, analyzing word by word what was said, which information was being exchanged. Well, I know from a fact that even though words have been said, not all messages are being transferred. Yeah? Because it happens to me every day that I speak to somebody who said, yeah, I told you about this yesterday. I don't remember. Yeah. So if we think of it in those terms, like, okay, we use words, we exchange information. But the actual information exchange is much wider. So if we want to research the exchange of information, we have to look at the bigger picture. We have to include all those different modalities. Right? And that's where it becomes really interesting. So we have to take a multimodal approach. And it can go further than facial expressions alone and emotions. We can also look at physiological data, heart rates, as a measure for excitement, for example. Heart rate goes up, can be a measurement for excitement or for stress load. Yeah. So multimodal research methods are growing. And facial expression analysis is a big part of that. And facial expression analysis has progressed a lot from the almost cartoonesque analysis that I was showing at the beginning of the presentation to something that is becoming a lot more intricate. Because the big breakthrough, at least for me, in facial expression analysis is what we call affective attitudes. And affective attitudes constitute mental states. So we can deduct specific mental states by looking at facial expressions over a certain period of time. Does that make sense? So if we analyze facial expressions in a temporal way, we can start interpreting the progression of facial expressions and come to what we call an affective attitude. So we can say, this is an interested person. This person is interested. Or this person is now bored. Or this person is now confused. Because confusion constitutes head movements. Yeah? You start shaking your head a little bit. You start moving your eyes around. You open your mouth. So it's a facial expression combined with head movements over a certain period of time. And if we can analyze all those things together, we can come up with a measure for confusion. Yeah? If somebody sits straight with their eyes open, focused on one point for a longer period of time, we can say this person is interested. Yeah? And if somebody leans back and they tilt their head a little bit and they look away from the corner of their eyes, you know, that might constitute boredom. But these things, mental states, consist of a facial expression and head movements, eye movements, body posture in some situations. Yeah. And this is where it gets interesting. Because here we're starting to tap into mental states. And that is, I think, what people were interested in when they first started to look at facial expression analysis. They wanted to know what was going on inside of their test subjects, not what was going on superficially on the face. Some fields of study do focus on that. Intercultural studies, it's very fascinating to read about. But most studies, especially consumer science, management training, language studies, anything to do with communication, this is what they're interested in. And if we now go back to doctor-patient interaction, how cool would it be if we can give doctors direct feedback on these affective attitudes in their patients? If I can give a doctor direct feedback on the mental state of their patient whilst they are trying to communicate information, it's super valuable. In teaching methods for teachers, I was last month I was in Singapore at the Nanyang Polytechnic, and they are trying to look into effective teaching methods. And they say we want to monitor boredom in students so we can alert our teachers to, hey, hang on, wait a minute, your students are getting bored. That means they're no longer paying attention, so you have to do something now. Yeah? Change the subject, come up with a new angle, put a silly picture on the screen, wake people up, bring their attention back to what you're trying to teach them. So these are the kind of things that we want to play with. This is what we're interested in. Right? So in the newest versions of our facial expression software, this is what we are working towards. Affective attitudes. They are now available as a part of the software package. And they provide insights into intent and perception. So how do people receive your message? And how do they deliver a message? And we can start thinking, because now it's only boredom, confusion, and interest, 3 affective attitudes. But we can think of more. And we can create these, what we call custom facial expressions in the software, to analyze all kinds of things. For example, analysis of the fake versus the genuine smile, the Duchenne smile. Or detection of pain in patients. In some situations, patients are unable to speak, so it's difficult to communicate pain. And then by analyzing facial expressions, that can be an interpretive measure for pain. Or we can look at workload analysis, stress levels. If we can find, in a way, the facial expression algorithm for stress, then we could constitute a new affective attitude, a new mental state. Right? So we can think of a lot of different things. Embarrassment, pride, amusement, or relief. And in a way, all these measures are 10 times more informative than a singular expression alone. Right? In addition to these facial expressions, what we've included in the later versions of the software is something that we call the RPPG method. And RPPG stands for Remote Photoplatismography. It's a difficult to pronounce word. Remote Photoplatismography. Basically, it's about light conductance of the skin. With every heartbeat, the heart pumps blood to the periphery of the skin. And this has an effect on light reflectance on the skin, especially in the eyes and around the eyes. And from video, we can then imply video algorithms to amplify that effect and analyze it. And that way, from a video image like this one, we can start calculating what the heart rate of that person is. So without ever touching my test subject, I can come up with an interpretation of their heart rate. And I can then use that heart rate as a measurement for stress load, excitement.
Does this solution has any limitation? Like, does it require the user to stand still, sit still, and not moving?
The facial expression software that we use at the moment requires frontal filming of the face. So we cannot work with freely moving subjects. We need to have a frontal view of the face. That's the requirement for our software package. Yeah.
And the heart rate detecting is bounded to the...
Yeah, it's bound to that.
Okay.
Yeah. If you turn away, their movement is allowed within the restrictions of the software. I think there is like 65-degree angle of the head. You can move around a little bit, but if a subject would get up and start walking around the room, it doesn't work anymore. The software does not work with freely moving subjects.
And how about the subject just stay down, and it takes how many seconds or how long to get the information of the heart rate?
Well, because you're measuring a temporal measurement, there is an initiation process. So I think it's about 10 seconds before you get a readout. Yeah, because we have to start counting somewhere. So you need that minimum amount of time to be able to get the first reading for the heart rate. There is a calibration initiation period. The same thing goes for the affective attitudes. Because I can only give a readout for a mental state if I have a minimum duration of expression analysis. If I want to measure boredom, boredom is a temporal related measurement. It is something that happens over time. It's not an instant thing. So over a certain amount of time, I can measure boredom. So before I get a boredom readout on the software, I also need at least, I think, 10 seconds of information to be able to make that calculation. Yeah, so affective attitudes, heart rate measurements, they take time to initiate in the software. There's a calibration period. Yeah. But ultimately, what you see is we're trying to incorporate more and more modes of data into facial expression measurements. And that, when we look into language research, communication research, will add valuable information to basically support research findings. Because we cannot look at facial expressions alone. We need those extra measures. And in a way, that is what my message today is all about. Facial expressions are never a single dimension. It's never singular. It's always wider. There's more aspects to it. Facial expressions alone will give very little information. But when we start looking into the context and we start approaching facial expressions in a multimodal way, all of a sudden a world of meaning opens up. And a lot of interpretive measures become available. Okay? So that kind of concludes my message for today. I hope you've gained some interest. I hope you've learned something. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. I travel to Taiwan quite regularly. I'm here once a year at least. But I'm in the lucky situation that I get to travel around a lot. Our headquarters are located in the Netherlands. We also have headquarters in Beijing and in Leesburg in the USA. But my area of operation is mainly Southeast Asia, where I work with our local distributors in Taiwan and in a number of other countries. So I am the privileged person within our company that gets to travel here every now and then, which I appreciate very much. I appreciate that you were all here today, and if I can help you with anything, please let me know. If you are interested in any of the information that I presented today, any of the scientific experiments that I presented earlier on, please have a look at our behavioral blog, because all these different research studies can also be found here. And then you can read them in your own time. Or if there are specific subjects that you're interested in, you can search for these subjects on the blog by using the search functionality, and you will get a lot of different entries suggesting different research studies that might give you extra information. So please, if you Google Noldus behavioral blog, you will get directed there, and please have a look around and try to find if there's any interested scientific research available there for you. Okay, thank you for a moment.
大家有什么其他问题有想要了解，可以再询问。那还是说我们先休息一下，如果待会有什么问题的话，可以再跟他询问。对，不然的话就是可能他待会再晚一点就会先离开这样子。对，那后面的话我们会在他离开之后，我们会再跟大家就是秀一下他现在 Face Reader 的一些最新功能的呈现这样。